And there we go. All right, so welcome back everybody to our third presentation of the day here at the National Biodiversity Teach-In. Today we have Loyola University professor, Dr. Joe Milanovich. Dr. Milanovich has prepared a really great presentation about amphibians for us today. And then Dr. Milanovich, if you're ready, take it away.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be here. I always like to start this off by having everyone give a round of applause to everyone who has worked at the teach-in, preparing this, and seeking out everyone and giving us so much support to do this. It's really great and fun to be here. So the way I usually like to do this is I have a small presentation prepared, but instead of holding your questions for the end, just go ahead and throw them up in the Q&A or the chat as much as you want throughout, even if it's unrelated to what I'm talking about. I can keep pace with the lecture and answer your questions at the same time. That's perfectly fine to do. So don't hold back. Just go ahead and ask away. So what we're talking about today are amphibians. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. So what we're talking about today is amphibians, and the lecture is really based on amphibians and their kind of function and what we're going to stand to lose, because what we'll see coming up is that amphibians are in peril across the world. Let's first talk about how cool these things are. Here are the amphibian species on Earth. There's almost 8,000 amphibian species that we know of globally. And I would say that's growing as well, because every time we go to the tropics and do an expedition, we find a few frog species here and there as well. Most of the amphibians on Earth are frogs and toads. They make up almost 90% of amphibians that we know of. Then the other groups are a lot smaller in number, but not necessarily less diverse. We have about 700 or so newts and salamander species. And then we have these really funky amphibians called caecilians that live in the tropics, and they sort of look like snakes, like the snake-worm combination. They're kind of funky. But what's cool to note is that amphibians have been on Earth for over 300 million years. So think about how long that is. The ancestors of amphibians that we see today in our world derive from these organisms that were hundreds of millions of years old. So whatever all these other organisms that went extinct went through, dinosaurs, etc., the amphibians did as well. So even though we think of them as really sensitive, they are hardy at their heart of their core. What these pictures represent here are some local amphibian species that we have in Illinois. Illinois is not the most diverse amphibian state, but we do have quite a few amphibian species that are really unique. If you want to learn more about amphibians and their life history, where they live, what they do, all the different types of species, then a good place to visit is amphibiaweb.org. And this organization is part of this consortium of scientists that update these records of amphibian species and where they live and what they do. And it's a really good resource to kind of learn more about amphibians and really anything you want, especially in North America. We have a quick question in the Q&A here. What does a typical workday look like for you? That's a good question, and I think it's really variable. So as a professor that does research, it's really a mixed bag of things that I do. So some days I'm teaching in the classroom, some days I'm teaching in the lab, other days I'm writing scientific papers. Sometimes I'm collecting research data either in the lab or in the field. I'm looking at through wetlands, I'm traipsing through forest or prairies. Sometimes that's really remote, sometimes that's really local. Oftentimes I write grants, I mentor students. So my day is pretty variable depending on what I'm doing. If it's a typical day in the field, then almost always we visit several different sites We might be counting salamanders. We might be trying to catch frogs. We might be taking blood from turtles. It's really kind of a mixed bag of stuff. And I think that's what really makes being an ecologist really special and fun. And especially those of us that work with animals, where we get to handle animals and ask questions about their life history and try to save them, try to conserve them. So my days are pretty mixed, but also really pretty exciting. So one of the cool things I was able to do when I was a graduate student, and this was really just something that we got lucky to do, was we were able to describe a new genus and species of salamander in the United States, which was pretty rare. It was the first in about 60 years that has been described, a new genus of tetrapods. That's the four-legged animals. And what's cool about this is a Passional Salamander. Me and my colleagues found it in Georgia, in this little stream on the side of the road in Georgia. And this is an adult female here, the Passional Salamander. This is a dime that she's sitting on top of. My colleague Bill Peterman took this picture. He was the first person ever to locate one of these animals. And we went on to describe it. And instead of just being a new species, it was a whole new genus of salamander. It was really, really unique. And what's really cool about this female here is she has eggs in her belly. So even though she is the size of a dime, she can curl up on a dime. She has about 10 or 12 eggs in her belly right now. And they lay them in streams. They hatch out and live for a few years, and then they metamorph and come on land. And that's more or less all we know about these. We only found a few dozen adults in total. We found several larvae because they live in the stream. They're kind of sort of like little fish, but they're tiny, tiny, tiny. So when you're looking at amphibians across the world, you can see with this map, these redder areas are the ones that have a lot more amphibian richness. And North America is kind of in that moderate level of richness for amphibians. We don't have as many species as South and Central America, but there's parts of the United States, like the Appalachian Highlands, that are really incredibly diverse with amphibians, and especially salamanders. It's one of the hot spots of the world. This little Passional salamander was found right on the edge, right in the foothills of the Appalachian Highlands. So there's probably more species of salamanders that we don't even know about that live in the Smoky Mountains of the eastern United States, and that will be described as we move forward here in the next 10 or 20 years. So even though we're in a more populated area in the United States, we're still able to find new species of amphibians. So there's so much more to learn about these organisms that it's really a fun field to be in. So why are these so cool? I think there's a number of reasons why. One of the really neat things about amphibians is that they're incredibly diverse. Tons and tons of species. There's a lot of diversity in what they do and how they do it. And what also is neat is that they're really abundant. So a lot of times species can be diverse, but there might not be a lot of individuals of them around. Amphibians are very different than that. There are a lot of diversity, and then there's also a lot of abundance behind that diversity. There's tons and tons of individuals of each species, pretty typically, that are around. Let's put that into context a bit. This is a really cool study that me and Dr. Peterman did from Ohio State. And what we did was we looked at this little tiny salamander. It's called the slimy salamander. You can see a couple pictures here. They're like this little black salamander with spots, and they live in the forest of the kind of eastern and central and southeastern United States. What we were able to do is do some surveys and some modeling, and we were able to estimate the population size of these little salamanders. We were able to count and estimate how many there were across the landscape. Then what we did was we looked at how much biomass that was. So we took some weights of salamanders, and we were able to estimate how much biomass or how much weight of salamanders was in these forests, and then how many nutrients they were storing. What we found is pretty interesting. You take this little tiny salamander about the size of your finger, and you add them all up, and you can estimate how many are across that landscape and how much weight they consume in that landscape. And what we showed is that the weight, the biomass of these salamanders in the forest was greater than all of the birds combined, was greater than all the small mammals, and was even greater than all the weight of deer in the forest. There's so many of these that even though they're about the size of your finger, they make up so much biomass and have so much nutrients in them that we propose that they're this really important part of the forest ecosystem, even though my guess is most people on Earth have never seen one of these things, and even though they're right in some people's backyards. What's also really cool about these organisms is that they have a lot of variation in their life history. And when we talk about how amphibians live in the world, a lot of times we think of these amphibians that are biphasic, that have these life cycles like a frog, where the adults travel to water or maybe live in water already. They lay their eggs in the water. You get these little cute tadpoles. They metamorph into these little froglets, and then they turn into adults. So they're using the water and the land. They're biphasic. That's really a typical way to think of most amphibians. But what we also see is that some amphibians do some weird things. Some of them can have that kind of biphasic life cycle where the adults are living on land, they lay their eggs, you get larvae, and then sometimes they can do this thing called paedomorphosis, where those larvae can grow up to kind of sort of adults, where they can reproduce and make eggs, but they stay in the water the whole time and they never lose their gills. Other times they can turn into adults. So you have this kind of weird variation there with animals that have this mostly biphasic life cycle. And then other times you can get animals that are completely terrestrial. So there's a number of amphibian species, especially in the United States. You have this group of lungless salamanders that live on the land 100% of the time. And what's cool about them is in their name. They are completely lungless. They're a vertebrate. They have a backbone, but they have no lungs. They breathe through their skin 100% of the time. And this is a picture of this slimy salamander species that I worked on in graduate school that lays their eggs underground most of the time. In this case, they lay their eggs in this mine shaft. And you can see the little larvae in these eggs. The mom will curl up and protect these eggs from predators. She gives antifungal properties. It's some really, really cool stuff going on. And this is just, again, just a thing the size of your finger that almost no one knows about. Okay, one quick question here. It looks like Donna asked, has the arrival of Alabama jumping worms affected amphibian population? That's a good question. So there are some research on amphibians and earthworms. So earthworms have kind of invaded the areas of the eastern United States, and they historically weren't here before. In the 1800s or so, they started encroaching in the United States and getting into the forest ecosystems. What we do know from this is that the earthworms have pretty big effect on nutrient cycling in the forest. And when it comes to amphibians, especially like salamanders, honestly, we've kind of seen in some ways they benefit salamanders because they can consume them. Salamanders eat them. The worms are really easy prey. They're pretty high in protein. And we can see that salamanders sometimes can get bigger in areas where there's earthworms. Sometimes they could have more babies. So they have some benefit. But then the earthworms also consume a lot of the leaf litter in the area. And that's what oftentimes these salamanders need to survive. They need to stay really wet and moist. And most of their other food resources come from these kind of leaf litter layers, I would say. So we're still studying the impact of earthworms on these ecosystems and amphibians in particular. But it doesn't look like it's devastating at this point in time, but it's most likely more harmful than it is good. What's also really neat about salamanders and amphibians in general is that they have permeable skin. That's one of the main characteristics that we probably think of when we think of amphibians, is that they have this porous skin. And this has really enabled them to survive in a lot of ways for 300 plus million years, because they could extract oxygen from a lot of different ways. Sometimes They can gulp air. If they're lungless, if they have lungs, they could use those. But even those that have lungs, like this wood frog, can still shut down their bodies completely and breathe through their skin. This wood frog's really unique that it can actually freeze solid, and actually does freeze solid in the wintertime. Up where we are in Illinois and Indiana, and they go all the way up to Alaska, they actually just say, oh, I'm just going to freeze solid and I'll thaw out in the spring, and that's it. So they're only able to really do this because they have this special permeable skin then and a bunch of different mechanisms that allow them to not have their cells burst. So this permeable skin is kind of a blessing in some ways for amphibians, but as we'll see coming up, it's also kind of a curse, because as we enter pollutants and toxins in the environment, amphibians have a lot easier time absorbing those than organisms that have tougher skin. Okay, another quick question here from Donna. She asks if they have salamanders are predators of these jumping worms. Yeah, we think they are to some degree, but not enough to reduce their populations, it seems. Okay, so why are we worried about amphibians? We probably hear it on the news that people are concerned about these. I just told you how diverse and abundant and amazing they are. But what we're seeing is that amphibians are undergoing a mass extinction event. And this is really a global mass extinction event for most organisms on Earth are undergoing this extinction event. This is not new. Historically, we've had extinction events in the past. What this graph is showing you here are the extinction events across the 600 or 700 million year period from about 600 million years ago to today. And here's the number of families that have gone extinct. And what we've seen in the past is that there have been these periodic extinction events in the Ordovician, the Devonian, the Permian, where a lot of life on Earth, most of life on Earth, had gone extinct from either climate changes or really intense ice ages, a mixture of all these different kind of factors. You may have heard of the really big one about 65 million years ago, the KT extinction. That's in that Cretaceous period. An asteroid hit the Earth, and it caused a bunch of changes that killed all the dinosaurs. So these mass extinction events aren't necessarily new to Earth. They have occurred, and we've documented their occurrence. What's new about this sixth mass extinction that we know about is that it's human-driven. It's human-caused. It's called the anthropogenic extinction, or the Holocene extinction. It's humans are causing changes to the Earth so much that it's causing these mass extinction events of all these different taxa, including amphibians. So that's why we're so concerned about amphibians and with respect to trying to conserve them. And there's a number of reasons why we want to do that, not just because they're really cool and really diverse, but as we'll see coming up, they have some importance to humans as well. So keep the questions going in the Q&A in the chat if you want. So here are the kind of context of amphibian declines. What we see is that currently we estimate that about 1/3 of all known amphibian species are at risk of extinction, which means they are either threatened or endangered or are about to be. So about 1/3 of the amphibians that we know of are really going to be in a tough spot, I would say, coming up. Now, what scientists have done, because we have this fossil record, we've been collecting data on organisms for several hundred years, we are able to document what's called the background extinction rate. So that is basically a rate at which we expect animals or organisms to go extinct naturally, which happens. Sometimes organisms just evolve differently. A new competitor comes in naturally. There's a number of ways that organisms can go extinct. But what we're seeing today is that the rate of extinction of amphibians is thousands of times higher than what we would expect it to be, than what we'd expect that background extinction rate to be. So much so that we know that at least 200 or so species have gone extinct in the past about 50 years of amphibians. This is just what we know. Remember, we're still documenting species and we're still describing them. So there could be species that have gone extinct that we didn't even know about existed. We also expect about another 7% or so of frog species in particular to go extinct in about the next 100 years. So these are really striking issues that we have. And in particular, this is just looking at these kind of estimates. This is not looking at the species that might not go extinct and just become threatened or endangered or lose a lot of individuals. So we're seeing this really mass decline of amphibian species as a consequence of these different effects that humans are causing. We have a few questions here. Okay, so how do we find amphibians in Illinois? Are there hotspots? That's a good question. There's a number of ways to find amphibians in Illinois. I live in Chicago, and I can find them here. Most of the time for amphibians in Illinois, you would look for a water source, either a wetland or a pond, and almost always, if it's a decent wetland or pond, there's going to be some frogs or salamanders in there. Another way to do it is to look on the areas right adjacent to these wetlands or ponds. So if you have a pond in your backyard, you can visit a forest preserve. Under those rocks and logs around those streams, around those lakes, rivers, and the ponds, the wetlands, around those areas, you'll find that there are amphibian species there in Illinois. If you really wanted to maximize the chance of doing it, I would go to a state park. And in particular, if you went to the southern part of Illinois, if you went to like the Shawnee National Forest, I don't think you'd have any issues finding amphibians there, even just crossing the trails or the roads, especially on wet or rainy days or nights. They're out and about in great numbers. If you really wanted to maximize it, I would go out in the spring, right after it rained in southern Illinois, or close to a forest or a pond or a wetland where you're at. And I would say you have a good chance of finding them. Remember though, if you lift up a log, put it back exactly where you found it, because that's where these things live and they need their habitat right where it is. One other question here is, have I ever studied the Austin blind salamander or the Puerto Rican rock frog? No, I haven't studied those yet. I've seen them in the wild. I've seen these blind salamanders that live in caves, and they're really unique looking. They look sort of like a normal salamander. They're kind of long. They have big ass kind of feet and legs, and they're all white because they don't need any pigment because they live in total darkness. And also they have either no eyes or their eyes are kind of covered up with skin. So they look kind of weird. I haven't studied them in particular, but I have seen them. They're pretty cool. We have another question here in the Q&A. Compared to other extinctions, how bad is a sixth extinction? That's a good question. It's bad enough that we know it's occurring, but it hasn't reached the point yet of being as bad as the other mass extinction events. What you have to remember, though, is what we can tell from the other mass extinction events is that they took several thousand years to occur. The asteroid one was different. That was probably 100 years and things were really in trouble. But the other extinction events were more of a slow burn. You know, the climate was changing through a period of hundreds of years, and organisms weren't able to adapt and catch up. So they happened over a longer period of time. What's really worrisome about the sixth mass extinction is that it really started about 100 years ago or less. And we're already seeing a much faster rate of extinction that we were hoping for. So the speed at which organisms are going extinct in this current mass extinction event is much faster than other ones, but it's not to the point where it's as bad as the other ones yet. But we expect it to get there. We all as scientists hope it doesn't. Part of this talk is geared towards how we can avoid that, but it's absolutely happening right now. Okay, a few more questions here. What's been the most surprising thing about your research? That's a good question. The most surprising absolutely was finding the new genus of salamander. That was that was something that happens maybe once in someone's lifetime, almost always not. And is something that I would say every ecologist dreams of, is trying to find a new species or genus of an organism that they're working on. That was absolutely the most surprising thing. The most surprising finding, I would say, of my research is how important these frogs and salamanders and amphibians are to ecosystems. It's something that not many folks really examined before I started working on it as a graduate student. So that's been one of the more surprising and gratifying things, is trying to look at and try to understand more about how important these organisms are. Okay, we have one more question, then I'll move on here. What my research's lab is like at Loyola. If I were to restart my career, what would you do differently, if anything? That's a good question. My research lab is incredibly diverse. It's filled with a bunch of colleagues that are Loyola students and graduate students, and then colleagues that have graduated and have worked with, that do a variety of really cool research. It's really geared towards, right now, looking at the impact of global change on amphibian and reptile organisms and their populations and what they do. So we do a lot of cool stuff. We work on snakes, we work on turtles, we do frog stuff, we do lab work. We're out in the field a lot. Sometimes we're several hours from a town in the middle of a forest. Sometimes we're right in the thick of the city of Chicago doing work. So our work is really, really diverse and really fun, and it's always engaging, and my students are really the best part of it. If I had to restart my career, would I change anything? I can't say I would. I have the best job in the world. I do the research that I want to, and I can't imagine changing anything, with my research program or my research career, honestly. Okay. So what we're going to do for the second half of this lecture is talk about why amphibians are declining. Here are the kind of causes that really surface. There's more than this, but these are really the ones that I would say are most pressing today. We are losing organisms to destroying habitat. There are a number of diseases that we'll talk about that are really causing havoc, some that we're still really worried about. And then there are a number of, I'm just going to lump it into pollutants. These kind of pollution and pollutants in the environment are harming amphibians. One that is more of a kind of predictive, coming up in the future cause of extinctions is global climate change. And then we have this issue of the pet trade and kind of over exploiting amphibian species as well. That's causing some of these declines that we're seeing right now. So we're going to go through these each kind of separately. Keep jumping up with questions. That's fine to kind of go through that. So habitat destruction is one of the major ones, and I would say for most species on Earth that are threatened or endangered or went extinct, the habitat destruction or fragmentation was almost always one of the first or second cause of these declines. So I put it at number one. I would say it's the most pressing issue we have on Earth in terms of biodiversity that doesn't change with amphibians. It comes in a couple different forms. Sometimes we can just completely change and destroy habitat where it's 100% gone. Where I'm sitting right now used to be prairie, this kind of prairie, hickory, maple forest, oak hickory forest with prairies mixed in, and probably a wetland because I'm about 100 meters from Lake Michigan. So it's not that now, right? I'm sitting in the city of Chicago. Sometimes we can just completely destroy habitat that exists. Other times we can do something like this, where we're fragmenting the landscape. We're fragmenting the parts of this suitable habitat. You can see in this picture here, there's patches of forest. In between those patches, we have this agricultural land. So whatever organisms live there have to now live in this matrix of getting through these forest patches, trying to get to the next forest patch. Now they have to cross this agricultural landscape. And a lot of organisms we're finding just can't do that. It just is not suitable or feasible for them to do. So we know that habitat fragmentation is a big issue in destruction as well, everywhere in the world. Literally everywhere in the world this is occurring. And it's one of the main reasons we're seeing these amphibian species decline, is because they need all these habitats. Remember, they're really biphasic, they're really complex. So if the habitat is there, they will live and thrive, absolutely. If it's not, they just can't do it. We also see that diseases are another kind of up and coming issue that amphibians have. And there's several that I wanted to highlight here. The first, and one of the most pressing that we have, is this fungus called the BD fungus. You may have heard of it called the chytrid fungus. This is something that's really unique and really a dangerous fungus that is around. What's unique about it is that this BD fungus is found in a lot of places in the world. I can go out to an Illinois wetland and detect the BD fungus, but it's not always really harmful to amphibians. What we found historically was right about 1980s or so, Dr. Karen Lips was studying amphibian populations in Central America, and she started seeing these really massive die-offs of these amphibian species. They identified this fungus here, and then what they did was document this kind of eastern invasion of this fungus, where they could search in eastern Central America one year and the amphibians were fine. The next year they would all have died from this BD fungus. So they were able to document this wave of this fungus that was spreading across Central America and killing many species along the way, and making many species extinct along the way as well. So this BD fungus is really something that's pretty worrisome. What we think, or best to our knowledge, is that it's something environmental. We think it may be this relationship with the warming climate that's triggering this fungus to be really dangerous. Another one that we're seeing is another fungus, lo and behold, called B-sal. This affects primarily salamanders, and right now it's restricted for the most part to Europe. I think it might be spreading a bit, but this B-sal fungus is another one that is similar to this chytrid fungus in the sense that it affects these amphibians that have pores and primarily the salamanders. The other one that I want to talk about is this ranavirus. The ranavirus is a virus that occurs in these aquatic environments in the water, and it can also cause these kind of mass die-offs of these organisms. Remember, these amphibians have this permeable skin, so we're really concerned about their ability to combat these new kind of fungal or bacterial or viral diseases that are occurring up. And what we expect is that these are going to increase as the climate warms. That's just the relationship that we're seeing with these diseases and the warming climate, as we expect them to get worse. We have a quick question here, or a couple, I think. The first one is, how are solar fields affecting the habitat? That's a really good question, and I can't answer that directly. What I can speculate is that if the solar fields are placed in areas that where you're destroying a forest, where you're draining a wetland, then I would say they're having a pretty major impact on amphibians. But as far as I know, that doesn't occur. These solar fields are oftentimes in land that is not productive land, or is in land that they're not destroying landscapes for the placement of them, oftentimes in the desert. So I don't expect that solar fields would have a major impact on an amphibian populations. I suppose it's dependent on how they're built and where they're located at. But I have no reason to suspect, if you're not destroying habitat to make them, that they would have any measurable impact on amphibians. A few more questions here. What setbacks have you had in your research, and how have you advanced your career? That's a good question. You know, in research, there's always so many setbacks that you can't even describe. Usually you kind of bottle them up and bury them. But some of the ones that I've definitely had is finding funding for research. That's oftentimes fairly difficult in the world of herpetology, of studying amphibians and reptiles, because let's face it, a brown frog or a black salamander that lives in the forest and surfaces once every year is not super charismatic to the public. So oftentimes it's hard to generate a lot of buzz around amphibian and reptile research. So we've definitely had setbacks in funding. We have had setbacks in, just dealing with the vagaries of field work. So sometimes you can set up a study site and a forest fire burns it, or it floods, or sometimes tornadoes come through them. I mean, it's just a variety of issues that happen. And I would say, the way to overcome it is really kind of how I feel I advanced my career, which is just kind of trying to persevere. That's really all it is. I grew up in Detroit, so I didn't really have exposure to nature or wildlife at all growing up, zero. And I went to college at Adrian College, a small school in Michigan, and that was the first exposure I had to anything wildlife at all. I didn't know what a salamander was. I'd never seen a snake in real life. So that was really an eye-opening experience for me. Once I found that passion, though, it just clicked. And for me, then, it was easy to persevere through whatever I needed to. I had a really difficult time in college at first. I was a first-generation college student. I didn't know what to expect in college. And it took me a while to really understand how to achieve in college. Once I did, that was great. Then I had a difficult time getting into graduate school because I didn't do great in college at first. So through that whole time, what really helped me advance my career was that I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be an ecologist. Once I started, once I found herpetology, I knew I wanted to be a herpetologist, and just persevering to achieve my goal was all I really wanted. That was it. So, every setback I had, I just tried to find a way around it, and that was really all I could do. And it worked out for me, thankfully. And also, really, I got quite a bit of luck as well throughout the process. Another question here: what are your thoughts on how they sell amphibians in pet stores? That's a really good question, and I think we can address that coming up in a bit as well. But I have a few thoughts. If the animal is raised in captivity, born and raised in a captive environment that is, let's say, not taking animals from the wild and are undergoing protocols that keep the animal safe and healthy, I'm all for having amphibians as pets. Absolutely. The problem is not every pet store or pet distributor for amphibians follows that. Sometimes they take them from the wild. Oftentimes they're taking many animals from the wild to sell. They don't necessarily have the cleanest practices. So I think it has to be significantly more regulated, and it has a great opportunity to transmit diseases and whatnot. But I enjoy amphibians. I don't have any as pets, but I like the educational aspect of it. But I really hope there's more regulation to it. Okay, pollutants. Amphibians have this permeable skin. It enters either their skin or the eggs at different stages, and they can cause a variety of issues. We've all probably seen these pictures of frogs with missing legs or extra legs. These are caused by these deformities from the developmental stage of pollutants. There's a number of pesticides and herbicides, pharmaceuticals. They're all entering these waterways. We have to understand that the earth is made up of watersheds. Everything that we put in the environment ultimately drains into watersheds. That's where these organisms live. So if you want to look at it, amphibians as a canary in a coal mine, there's some, you know, varying views on how effective that is. But when you look at pollutants in amphibians, they are absolutely canaries in coal mines. Absolutely. Whatever they are being exposed to in the water is also what humans are exposed to. It's also what humans are consuming in their waterways as well. So if we're seeing these impacts from amphibians, sometimes it can cause death, sometimes deformities. Oftentimes it can alter the sex ratios of amphibians. We're now feminizing a lot of frog populations because the pharmaceuticals that we take in our body, we're excreting out into our toilets. That's ultimately entering our waterways, even after being treated at the wastewater plants. And we're starting to see impacts that are pretty significant on amphibian populations where our pharmaceuticals are changing the hormones of frogs. Now, what's the concentration that's needed to start doing that to humans? We don't know, but it's happening to vertebrates right now. So that's something that is causing great harm to amphibians right now and is increasing the rate at which they're declining and changing their populations. But it should be an enormous red flag for humans that we're seeing this habitat fragmentation, these diseases and pollutants harming organisms right now that we live amongst. I think that should be a really big red flag. In particular, the pollutant issue is one that with regulation can be corrected. Climate change is another one that we're really concerned about. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more or less a future concern. We're starting to see now that climate change is changing what we call the phenology of salamander and frog populations, even in the United States. The warming and changing climate is starting to change when organisms do things, when these frogs start breeding, when they start coming up from hibernation, when they start going down, when they start producing their young and the rate at which they're growing. All these different things are starting to change now already. What we haven't seen are what we would consider like mass declines of amphibian populations as a function of climate change. We haven't really seen that yet, but it's something that we fully expect to do. This is a study that my graduate student Brock Struker did, where he looked at the amphibian species in the United States. He was able to model how these organisms might live in the environment as a function of changing climate in the future. What Brock's model showed was that if you look at the amphibian species richness in the Midwest, we're about right here in Illinois, these red areas are where you would find more amphibian species. So you can see the Ohio River Valley is a really pretty rich area. There's a lot of amphibian biodiversity there. And with a little change in the climate, Brock saw that this wouldn't change drastically. But if climate changed more strongly, if we got warmer and warmer as we're predicting in this Midwestern area, you see that a lot of these areas are getting darker in terms of this darker blue, which means they're cooling off the biodiversity in Brock's paper that he wrote. They are reducing the amount of species that we predict can live in this area based on the climate that would be there. So what Brock showed and a number of other studies are showing is that as you look into the future and how the climate might change and how fast it's changing, we really are concerned that these amphibian species won't able to survive. Think of amphibians as they're kind of like a plant that's really an animal. They don't really move much. They're not really mobile. They can't fly. They don't have hooves and long legs where they can cross a mountain range. So if the environment's changing where an amphibian lives, then it's really hard for them to get away from that. They have to deal with it. So they're a really good proxy, I think, for what a lot of organisms might be impacted with in the future. So when Brock is showing these results that suggest these organisms will be impacted pretty severely with respect to climate change, we should listen to them. The last one I want to talk about here, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for questions, is the pet trade. So we brought it up a bit in one of the questions earlier. I am for amphibians being raised in captivity and that as an avenue of people having amphibians for pets. Once you start collecting animals for pets from the wild, or in this case, the overexploitation is sometimes using amphibians for food sources, I think that's where you start getting into trouble. You know, if you're collecting animals from the wild to serve as pets or to implement in the pet trade, you're not just removing those animals from the wild, so they're ecologically dead, you're also increasing a lot of transmission for disease. And that's where we think this B-sal fungus really derive from is the pet trade. And we're really concerned that it could spread through the pet trade as well. And then also when you're looking at this overexploitation of collecting animals for food, in this case, collecting too many organisms for food, that is also combined with this pet trade to really significantly reduce these amphibian populations. And a lot of times this is global in nature. There's hotspots in the world that are really significant or have significant issues with pet trade and overexploitation, but it's really a global issue nonetheless. What does this mean? Or why should we care that amphibians are declining? Why does it matter that they're declining? Well, there's a number of answers for that. The first one is that these amphibians are incredible food for other animals. That's just the simple truth of it. They are little packets of protein. Where they exist, there's usually a ton of them, and they're pretty easy to catch. If you practice catching a frog a couple times, you'll probably catch them. And guess what? These snakes, these birds, they've evolved to catch frogs as food. Luckily, there's many, many of them to eat. So their populations continue to trudge along where there's good habitat, and these organisms have a lot of really great prey resources. So we know that they're important for this, let's just say this food web, they're a really important part. And if you pulled them out of the food web, we're not sure what will happen. And I don't think any scientist wants to find out what will happen. What we also know is that these amphibians are really important for the functioning of ecosystems. So think about this aspect that they're really abundant. You could have 2 or 3 salamanders per square meter in a forest. So if you look at a football-sized field of a forest, there might be 500,000 salamanders there. So think about that, 500,000 salamanders across the size of a football field area of forest. All those salamanders, although are small, they're also being salamanders. They're eating, they're going to the bathroom, they are being food for other organisms. That's all nutrient cycling. These salamanders are little packets of nutrients eventually, or essentially. So if you look at this salamander here, it's going to eat bugs in the forest. And this is something that I studied before. These bugs are going to have different levels of phosphorus in them. This salamander needs phosphorus, has to get it from what it eats. It's going to eat these bugs. It's going to take that phosphorus. It's going to say, hey, my bones need this much. My lipids need this much. They allocate all the phosphorus they need. And the rest of the phosphorus gets pooped out. Literally, they're pooping out organic and inorganic forms of phosphorus and nitrogen and sulfur and all these really important compounds. So what this amphibian is doing is taking this bug, which is organic, it's eating it, and is pooping it out into largely inorganic forms. Plants can then use that. A plant can't take a bug and digest it, most plants, and use it for growth. A plant needs something else to eat it and convert it into something inorganic that a plant can then take up and use. Salamanders are doing that. There's so many of them in the environment that as they eat and go to the bathroom, they're acting as this really big, important nutrient cycler in forest. And we think that most amphibians are doing this as well. They're cycling nutrients in streams, in wetlands, in ponds, in the forest. So again, they're not just good food resources, but now we show that they have this really important contribution to cycling of nutrients in ecosystems. We don't want to lose that. Medical advancements. This is something that's really unique to amphibians. Every time someone goes to the tropics that is looking at using these compounds and chemicals that amphibians produce, they find something interesting. There's research studying how to cure cancer from compounds that are only found in amphibians. Amphibians can regenerate limbs. Think about if we can study the mechanisms of that and try to apply it to humans. You can cut off a salamander's arm and it will grow it back. Think about that, growing back limbs and what sort of processes go through that. It's cool to think of this. They've had hundreds of millions of years to work this out. Humans haven't been on Earth that long. We can steal their techniques. That's something that we can do. So there are a number of medical advancements that amphibians have helped humans derive. And if we start seeing, if we continue to see this decline in amphibians, we're losing species that we haven't studied, the medical advancements that we might be able to achieve from them. And we're also losing species that we've never seen before that might have things that we haven't even dreamed of yet. Poison dart frogs are a good example of this. The poison in their skin is produced from what they eat. They basically eat these ants that have a particular toxic compound. These frogs can then accumulate and digest that and then produce it in their bodies. And they're one of the landmark species of medical advancements. The toxins they produce have been used in a number of pharmaceutical drugs and cancer treatments and regeneration of things. So they're really this important peg in this medical advancement whole that humans have. So they're not just directly influencing ecosystems, which are easy to ignore as humans. They're directly influencing medical advancements for humans. So they're really important organisms to have on Earth. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I would be happy to answer any questions you have about this presentation or anything else. And thank you all for your time. So I have the chat and the Q&A open. Any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Okay, here's a good question in the chat. What would you recommend for someone that's interested in the field and is considering Loyola? That's a really good question. What I would recommend is someone is interested in the field of ecology or herpetology or anything like that. I would say the first thing I would do, especially if you're looking at coming to Loyola, is I would major in either biology or environmental science. And that would give you a really good foundation of the processes that go on in the field of ecology and herpetology. The next thing I would do is start seeking out opportunities to do research. There's tons of opportunities at Loyola. There's opportunities in the Chicago area. And honestly, wherever you live, there's probably a herpetology club or an ecology club or a plant club or butterflies, anything you ever want. And that's the first step, is just start making connections. So if you went on to, major in biology in college, then that would open up a lot of opportunities for you. And then just start trying things out. Just start volunteering and looking at things and trying to meet with folks. And, I haven't met an ecologist yet that isn't super excited to meet with high school students and elementary students and college students that are excited about research. That just doesn't happen very much because we're so excited about it. Another question here is, what's my favorite amphibian to study? My favorite, by far, the group of lungless salamanders that live in the Smoky Mountains. I study them every year. I've studied them for, I don't want to say how long because that would give how old I am, almost 20 years. So the group of lungless salamanders in the Smoky Mountains are incredibly diverse. It's the most, one of the most diverse hotspots of lungless salamanders in the world, if not the most diverse. And they're incredible. They're really unique in their life history. They're really colorful. And the areas they live in are some of the prettiest areas in the world, I think. Another question here is, what's the best part of running your own name? I think they may be running my own lab. I think the best thing about running my own research lab is that I get to ask questions and answer them limitlessly, whatever I want. There are times where I was driving around with my kids and or taking a hike, and they would have a random question, and I would be able to set up a research study to answer it. And that's just the coolest thing in the world. Not just because I think it maybe makes me look cool to my kids, but it's just really great to be able to answer questions that you pose yourself, and also in particular ones that will help the conservation of species. That's really gratifying too. Okay, a few more questions. What's my favorite amphibian? My favorite is absolutely the Passional Salamander. That's the one that me and my colleagues were able to describe. I think it's the coolest salamander on planet Earth. It's the second smallest salamander in the world. It's incredibly unique in its life history. It's found in maybe a 3 square kilometer area in the entire planet. So it's incredibly rare. And that's by far my most favorite. Another question here is, with taking animals from the wild, if you catch a frog, how long should you be able to look at one before releasing it? So my preference, what I generally tell folks is, if you catch a frog, you got about an hour or two to hang around with it. I wouldn't bring it home because there's a lot of fungal and bacterial and viral diseases that you can give that frog if you bring it home. So if you're going to handle animals in the wild, I prefer to use gloves, just a pair of nitrile gloves to do it. If you don't, make sure your hands are wet because amphibian skin is pretty sensitive. And I would say enjoy it for an hour or so and then release it right where you found it. Okay, Vanessa asked what inspired me to go into the field. That's a really good question. You know, all I can say is that it just fascinated me. That was it. As I mentioned, I grew up in Detroit, so I didn't have a lot of exposure to ecology or wildlife or anything. Once I did, it just absolutely floored me. It was just the coolest thing in the world for me to think that I can go out in the wild and catch wild animals and study them. It just blew my mind that you can do that. How much time do I spend every day studying amphibians? That's a good question. Right now, 0. It's freezing cold outside. Once it warms up in the spring, I would say I spend probably about a week a month in the field studying amphibians, maybe a little bit more. And once it kind of cools down, I usually study amphibians a different way. I usually study the data analysis or I write about them. But I would say in my job, probably 6 months a year for about, a week or 2 a month, I'm in the field studying them. So it's pretty fun. Okay, what's my favorite place that I've gone for research? That's a really good question. I think I have two or three. That's really not a favorite. My all-time favorite is probably the Smoky Mountains. In particular, Great Smoky Mountain National Park is probably my all-time favorite. My second favorite is probably Mount Rainier National Park. My third is I spent a lot of time in the desert of New Mexico. That was really cool too. Okay, another question is how many species I've researched. Oh, geez. Dozens. You know, when I studied lungless salamanders in the Smoky Mountains, I would oftentimes find 20 species a day. So when you weave that into all of the work I've done on reptiles and insects and everything else, dozens and dozens of species I've studied. Okay, so where have I gone to do research on animals? Let's see, I've done research in Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, Massachusetts, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, New Mexico, Washington, Oregon, and Alabama, and Arkansas. A lot of places. And Canada. I've been in Canada as well. So a lot of places in the US and in Canada. Okay, how has the pandemic affected amphibians? That's a good question. I don't think we quite know yet. I suspect not very much. If it did anything, maybe it reduced the amount of pet trade impact on amphibians because folks maybe not were as actively going out to collect them for a while. But I don't think we really suspect amphibians were impacted by them. Here's a question in the chat here. Has there been any species that you've been nervous to study? That's a good question. Yes, in New Mexico, I was studying reptiles and small mammals, and handling venomous snakes is not my favorite. I've done it. I've been trained on it. I don't like it. So handling venomous snakes was never my favorite. And I'm not a big small mammal guy. Handling small mammals that bite was never something I liked either. But I've never been nervous to study any amphibian species. Okay, thank you, Kenyon Middle School. Thank you guys. You're great. Thanks for coming up.
Hi, your presentation was great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here again. It was great hearing from someone so passionate. And it was really cool how you explained everything, especially the impact. So thank you so much.
Good. No, thank you. I'm glad you all liked it. It was fun.
Yeah. We really look forward to hopefully seeing you again next year. And otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.